I see people make this mistake all the time when trying to understand what the Bible might mean for them. They treat it like a magical book that fell from the sky. It didn't. Like it has words and phrases that function like standalone incantations that will do something to or for you if you read them in the right lighting or with the right music. It's not, and it won't. It's more like a library of ancient documents written by specific authors to specific audiences for specific purposes. So when you pull a verse or a story out of its context, you'll likely misunderstand or miss that specific purpose altogether. For example, Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, records Jesus telling a story about a fruitless fig tree. Then he told this parable. A man had a fig tree growing in his vineyard, and he went to look for fruit on it, but didn't find any. So he said to the man who took care of the vineyard, "For 3 years now I've been coming to look for fruit on this fig tree and haven't found any. Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil?" "Sir," the man replied, "leave it alone for 1 more year, and I'll dig around it and fertilize it. And if it bears fruit next year, fine. And if not, then cut it down." End of story. So what's the meaning? Well, without understanding the context, it could kind of mean anything, but I'll tell you this much. Whatever way you try to spin this story, it always is going to sound like a threat. I mean, fruitless fig trees get cut down. No results, no reward. If you don't produce, you're a waste of space and you're going to get cut out. It sounds like Jesus, right? It sounds more like business bros on TikTok to me. And that's because we haven't looked at the surrounding context yet. Luke says, "Then Jesus told them this parable." When's then? Well, if you look just before this, Jesus was having a discussion with this same group of people about how to interpret the judgment of God. They were wondering if you could interpret a person's death, whether from an enemy or by an accident, if you could interpret their death as God's judgment on them. Well, why were they talking about interpreting God's judgment? Well, it's because Jesus had just told them a story indicating that they were headed for God's judgment. It was a story about a master who gave his servants some tasks and then left for a while but was going to come back. The story stressed the troubles that those servants would be in if the master came back and found them not doing his will. What was the master's will? Well, that's also a good question. Hold on to it because we're going to come back to it. But first, Jesus then said, this historical moment is like these people are on their way to court, about to be judged and found guilty, and then he criticized them for not recognizing any of this. He said, it's great, you can predict the weather patterns, but you can't predict your own behavioral patterns and see where they're leading? And then he tells the fig tree story. And the point is to say, hey, heaven's been wondering if this is the year you finally get your act together. And to be honest, it's not really looking good. The leading indicators seem to be pointing to yet another year as a fruitless fig tree. Well, how can you be sure? I mean, what are those leading indicators? Well, that's also a good question. Right before his judgment stories, Jesus was having a conversation with his disciples and the crowd listening in about how to not chase after earthly treasures. Well, why were they talking about earthly treasures? Well, it's because a person from the crowd had just asked if Jesus would step in and settle a dispute with his brother over money, and Jesus said no, and then instead gave this really harsh lecture about the dangers of greed, and he told a story about someone who amassed a ton of money and did nothing with it during his time on earth, and then he died. Why the harsh response about greed? Because right before that question had interrupted him, Jesus was in the middle of telling his disciples to stay away from the Pharisees and the rest of the religious leaders, for that matter, and to not live like them. Why? Mostly because of their greed. Well, how do you know that? Because right before that conversation with the disciples, Jesus was having a very uncomfortable dinner with those religious leaders in which he laid out 7 criticisms about how they lived their lives. You might even say 7 reasons he thought they were fruitless fig trees. And a bunch of them had to do with greed. And he tops it all off saying you're not any closer to God because of your wealth, your position, your status, your religious devotions, and your rituals. You're actually further from him, and you're leading people further from him and his will. Oh yeah, and what was God's will? What were the people of God, the servants, supposed to be doing? Well, for that answer, you'd have to go all the way back to a man named Abraham, because God told Abraham that he would bless him and make him into a tribe that would bless all tribes, a nation that would benefit all nations, which was a wild idea because in that context, the purpose of tribes was to bless, protect, benefit, and advance your own tribe. But they were supposed to be a blessing to all nations. And Jesus is basically criticizing them, saying, you haven't been bearing that fruit. All of this is context to explain the point of his parable to his listeners, to say, I'm here to tell you, says Jesus, we're in the last metaphorical year to produce fruit. We're in your grace period. Judgment is coming. You're on your way to court. The master is returning. Your life will come to an end at some point. You've only got so much time. All of these are different ways for Jesus to say, what are you doing with the life that you have? Because all of the leading indicators are predicting doom. Don't follow the religious leaders. Don't live like them. Don't live a life of hypocrisy, devoting yourself to rituals designed to make you look good, not actually do good. Don't live a life of greed, finding loopholes in the law that allow you to ignore the people who actually need your generosity and mercy in the first place. Don't chase symbols of status that people honor. Instead, be an honorable person who takes care of people. And don't be a religious, legalistic fanatic, making it impossible for anybody to measure up to your standards. Don't be a fruitless fig tree. Now, that still kind of sounds like produce or get purged, right? Well, wait, because there's more. Understanding the context isn't just about understanding what happened before the fig tree story. It's also about what happens after. What happened after? Great question. Look at the story Luke decides to put right after the fig tree parable. It's a story about Jesus healing a woman on the Sabbath. A story about Jesus breaking the law, going against Scripture, bucking the religious ritual in order to bring rest. Why this story next? Because that's what fruit looks like. That's what the vineyard owner is looking for. That's what the returning master wants to find his servants doing. Fruit looks like setting things right in someone else's life, regardless of the religious rules. It's acts of mercy and generosity. And then what does Jesus do next? He tells the story of the mustard seed. A story about a seed that grows into a tree that's so expansive that its branches can reach 20 to 30 feet in the air, 20 feet across. I mean, it's a metaphor for small acts compounding over time to become something huge. For Jesus, it's a story about the growth of the kingdom of God, for what he thought the world could be like. It starts with small acts of kindness and generosity, and it grows into a place where, as he puts it, birds perch in its branches. Perch. Nest. Rest. Ooh, I really love this detail. The word here for bird is actually more specifically a reference to undomesticated birds, to wild birds. Jesus' point for his listeners is don't be a fruitless fig tree, following the Pharisees, living a life of status, greed, and hypocrisy, ignoring generosity and justice and opportunities for mercy. Instead, participate in the kingdom mustard tree, giving the world seed-sized snapshots of what heaven on earth with your life could be, small acts that resemble a world made right. One more question. Why did Luke include this story? Why this parable? I mean, what was his intent in arranging the stories the way that he did? I mean, this is a parable directly aimed at the first century Jewish religious leaders and by extension, those who followed their example. But if you didn't know this, Luke's audience, the person that he wrote to, wasn't Jewish. They didn't follow the Pharisees. They didn't know the history of Abraham. They didn't have the Torah. They didn't have the Jewish religious laws. Their ancestors weren't called to be a blessing to all nations. Luke's original audience wasn't a fruitless fig tree. So why did Luke include this story in this way for his audience? Friends, his audience isn't the fruitless fig tree being threatened with one more year and then you're getting cut down. They were the wild birds who had been invited to find rest in the mustard tree kingdom. The wild birds who were offered mercy and grace and healing and rest from the God who loved them so much he thought that they were worth dying for. Luke tells this story because he knows it's so easy for a religion to drift towards legalism and loopholes and away from genuine love and healing and acts of mercy in the world. So he includes it as a reminder, a warning perhaps, but even more than that, as an invitation to Jesus' vision for what the world could be like. And that's what this parable in its context means for you. It's not a threat, produce or be purged, put up or shut up. Jesus came and broke the rules, ignored the rituals, and gave his life so that you would know and find rest in the branches of God's love. The God of the universe thought you were worth dying for. That's the heart of the Christian faith. This text, in its proper context, written by Luke for his audience, says, "May you remember how loved you are, dear wild bird resting in the branches, and may you resist that slide into legalism that keeps you from loving others, so that you can live as people of love in a world that desperately needs more of it." Now, if you want to learn more about how to make sense of this book we call the Bible, you should check out one of these videos next. But for now, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.